This is the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, a podcast brought to you by two physical therapists devoted to helping physical therapists and other healthcare providers become better educators to patients, students, the community, and each other by interviewing prominent and passionate people within the realms of healthcare and education. The Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast is intended literally for educational and entertainment purposes only. No clinical decision-making should be based on only one source, and therefore this podcast should not be used as personal medical advice. While care has been taken to ensure accuracy, occasionally mistakes and factual errors can be present, as we are only human. This is our journey on the road to becoming better educators, so get ready with your pen and paper as class is about to begin. Hello everyone, and welcome to our first interview episode. My name is Brandon Powen, and I am joined by my co-host F. Scott Fiel, and we had an absolute blast interviewing John Childs about an overview of the PT education model. Now, John is a true innovator, and he's definitely driving change with PT entry-level education. And it was very enlightening to hear his perspective on many of the pressing issues facing DPT education, along with some solutions. Now, we realized that we didn't discuss much in detail about the Baylor and South College DPT programs, but we're looking to having John Childs and other representatives from the Baylor and South College DPT programs, along with a current student in the South College program, in for a future episode, so it will be covered. So without further ado, we present our interview with John Childs. All right, welcome everyone to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. And today we are honored to have the one and only Dr. John Childs joining us. Dr. Childs, thank you so much for your time and for coming on the show with us.
Thanks, glad to be here.
So many people in the physical therapy profession know Dr. Childs as the founder and CEO of Evidence in Motion, which is the largest provider of post-professional educational programs in the PT industry. Dr. Childs, do you think you could tell us a little bit about, your journey as a PT and about your experience throughout your various roles as a clinician, educator, and administrator?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you a little bit of background. I graduated from the Air Force Academy back in the mid 1990s, 1994 to be exact. So I had a bit of an unusual path as a physical therapist in that when I graduated from college, I was commissioned in the Air Force as a second lieutenant, and then went straight to graduate school, which was PT school in my case, in the U.S. Army Baylor program, which was a master's program at the time. Graduated in, it was about an 18-month or so program, finished up in the summer, I think, of 1996, and then was in clinical practice for 3 to 4 years at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, then went to Columbus, Mississippi. Was only in Mississippi, for about 10 months and got picked up to get my PhD. And that was a real pivotal point in my career because I was debating about getting out of the Air Force, staying in. My commitment was, coming to an end. And when the Air Force dangled the PhD opportunity out there for me to stay in the Air Force, that was, for an educational junkie like me, that was too hard to resist. And that was really the beginning of what I would call the sort of the academic educational phase of my career. Eventually led to me being involved in a number of startups in the PT industry, which has been, a tremendous journey over the last number of years.
Yeah, Dr. Childs, first off, thank you so much for your service. I've been a physical therapist now for 10 years, and I've followed your career for just about all 10 of those years. My question was, what do you feel is the biggest limitations or restrictions currently in DPT education utilizing the current mainstream model?
It's a great question. The way I sort of frame it is, when I went to PT school, master's degree was sort of the mainstay. We had already made the shift from bachelor's to master's. For the most part, there were still some bachelor programs around when I went to PT school. But for the most part, master's was the norm, and programs were about 18 months in length, I would say, on average. And then all of a sudden, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there becomes this shift towards the DPT. And we could hash out all the reasons why, that sort of happened, whether that was a good idea, bad idea. It doesn't really matter. In this case, it's the DPT, and that's what it is. But in any event, when it went to the DPT, higher education really saw an opportunity to tack on another year, in some cases, year and a half of education. The demand for PT school was quite high. It still is. So where there's a willingness to pay tuition, there are institutions of higher ed that are more than happy to accept those tuition dollars. I joke with individuals that if the market would support a 5-year DPT, I can assure you that academics would find a way to stretch it out even further. I mean, all of a sudden, all these esoteric skills that are so-called advanced skills, trust me, they would become entry-level requirements in these 5-year programs. The reason DPT is not 5 years is because the market really won't support that. They found sort of this sweet spot at 3 years. And I say that to say this: when you look at the content that was actually added to the curriculum to sort of get us from the master's to the DPT, you're talking about pharmacology, radiology, imaging. Maybe that's 4 to 6 months of content. So we sort of make the case that if you would have right-sized DPT education around the needs of the curriculum, it would probably have gone from about 18 months to 2 years. Instead, it went from 18 months to 3 years for supply-demand sorts of reasons that had really nothing to do with the curriculum and the sort of the requirements of what you need to get to that doctoral degree. So over the years, of course, what's happened is we've gotten longer and longer education. Tuition keeps going up and up and up. And it's not lost on any of us that salaries among PTs have stayed relatively flat despite the transition to the DPT. So you have students with higher and higher debt loads making the same amount of money as those of us who made when we graduated from PT school in the mid-90s, obviously adjusted for inflation. And so the return on investment as a PT is becoming less and less compelling. And we think that poses a serious threat to the applicant pool. I tell folks all the time, I've got 5 kids, and I could never recommend that one of my children become a physical therapist, at least based on some return on investment type metric. And that embarrasses me a bit that I would have to perhaps counsel my kids to consider another career, especially at, $150,000 tuition type schools, where you're going to be paying student loans for 20, 30 years. You're never going to get out of debt. Certainly as therapists, we get into the profession for reasons that are above and beyond financial. And that's a good thing. That defines, I think, some of our caring, our empathy, but it still has to make common sense from a financial perspective. And we think that return on investment is increasingly becoming a threat to, or the lack of return on investment, a threat to the future of the applicant pool. What used to be, your grandparents were proud if they graduated from high school. Our parents were proud if we graduated from college. We're proud of our kids if they go to a great grad school. And so we certainly see this kind of educational creep where you go to high school is less important than where you go to college is less important than where you go to grad school. And so, grad school is sort of the ticket now to the sort of the middle class working force, if you will. Whereas now college is like what high school used to be, kind of gets you into sort of an entry-level job.
What changes do you feel that a majority of the DPT programs are going to need to make in order to provide better education to their students in the future? Realizing that, every program is very specific, but what are some changes that you think that a lot of the DPT programs will need to make?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I'll use the analogy of clinical research to kind of apply it to the educational realm. So if you look at clinical practice over the last 20 years, one of the things that we've recognized is that there's a huge variability in practice, right? Certain therapists use certain techniques for a patient with back pain. Others, manipulate them. Some use more exercise. Some, wave little wands over them called ultrasound. And right, there's just this massive variability. If you took a patient with back pain, stood them up in front of a room, brought in 50 to 100 therapists, all 50 or 100 of those therapists would likely treat that individual sort of differently. We recognize that as a profession, and we set out on a course of clinical research over the last 15 or 20 years that has produced an abundance of research that has really helped to inform best practice for patients with any number of musculoskeletal conditions. Now, that doesn't mean all the variability in practice has gone away, but certainly I think it would be hard to argue that we've not become more consistent in our care processes. If nothing else, for example, passive care, we know now for sure just does not work. And we need to move towards more active care, more psychologically informed care. And so we've got a lot of data to guide our decisions. So let's apply that now to the educational sector. So if you look at PT schools, there's been probably 240, 250 schools or so, and there's massive variability in how those programs are run. Every program has its own sort of introduction to biomechanics kind of lectures. there's really very little to no focus on educational research. We've put a lot of emphasis on how to practice better in the clinic, but there's extremely little data on models of education that are optimal for building the next generation of physical therapists. And worse than that is that these educational programs, they don't cooperate well together at all, right? They live within their little brick and mortar fiefdoms, and the faculty in each of those schools sort of thinks it has the cat's meow, if you will, of the body of knowledge that's necessary to teach their students. So if I'm on faculty in a program, my content is my content, your content in another program is your content, and we sort of claim our intellectual property to our content, and we don't share it across programs. And so as a result, students get, again, this very kind of wide variation in practice or in their education, both in the didactic phase, but even worse is in the clinical education phase. And that's where we think the real black eye is of DPT, is that we send therapists out to the clinic, and then we sort of hope and pray that they catch something useful while they're out there, really having no idea what they're learning, in most cases, no objective sort of outcome measures and those sorts of things that can, and then in many cases, our clinical educators are very loosely connected to the academic programs. I mean, we still have situations where students show up on a rotation and it's a surprise to the CI that a student is there on a Monday morning. And that's a problem. I say that, the only requirements to be a clinical educator is you got to have a heart rate and a pulse and a license. And if you meet those three things, there are many schools that are willing to send you students. And that's just not an optimal way to train.
Sure, no, absolutely. And kind of with that, Dr. Childs, what do you feel is the best solution to that problem?
Well, this gets to the heart of kind of the journey we've been on the EIM side over the last number of years. For our first, 10 years of our history, we really focused on post-professional education in a blended model. So residency programs, fellowship programs, certification programs. And then call it 2011, 12, sometime in that time frame, we really got interested in seeing if we could take some of those strategies that we had learned in blended learning in the post-professional world and sort of move that upstream into entry level. And our first sort of effort was trying to tackle clinical education, because on the EIM side, on the post-professional side, we had this big network of outpatient clinics, hospitals that partnered with us on residency fellowship. So we had a lot of really highly motivated clinicians who had gone through our program. So somewhat of a standardized set of clinical educators, if you will, that were very motivated to train students in a consistent model. So we built a curriculum. We invited schools to participate. If you were willing to send students for a minimum of 6 months up to a year, we would help you place those students into our network, which we thought was a big asset to support DCEs in their role for matching students. And so we built this sort of network, and very few programs really wanted to participate. Because of that real insular nature, I think they were sort of threatened by sort of this outside entity coming alongside them and supporting them in matching students. It becomes the fear of, well, if EIM is going to match our students, then why do we need a DCE to do that job, right? So there's sort of a threat. There were a few programs that came along, but we thought it was a build it and they'll come type model, and that just did not happen at all. We underestimated the tendency towards the status quo in higher education. And this gets on, I could beat on this bully pulpit all day long, but when you have such a robust applicant pool, which we do, there's 6 or 7 applicants for every seat. You have students that are largely graduating successfully and passing the licensure exam, which is, kind of the litmus test of whether a program is succeeding or not. There are many, well-intended educators that sit around conference tables and argue that there's no problem in PT education because the outcomes of passing the licensure, students are getting jobs. What's the problem? And so there's a huge tendency towards the status quo. We underestimated that and finally realized, gosh, if we want to make a dent in PT education, we're actually going to have to get into the PT education business soup to nuts. So from the very beginning, when a student's recruited, all the way to the very end, if we're going to have any ability to realize some of the changes, at least we think will be pivotal for the next generation of therapists.
Yeah, so what can we do as students of physical therapy, physical therapists, and educators to contribute to this solution?
Yeah, again, very fair question. If you want to do it in your lifetime, I think you have to sort of start from scratch. And that may be a bit cynical because there are a lot of very, I think, progressive faculty with some terrific ideas for upgrading their own program and their own curriculum. The problem with that is unless you have a leadership structure within your program that really allows you to be innovative, disrupt the sort of the status quo, and make decisions without consensus, then you're going to have a really hard time influencing the curriculum of that program. Because by and large, faculty in traditional programs sit around a table, everybody throws out their idea, and you talk until you get to some level of consensus. And consensus is just not the way that you're ever going to make change. You ultimately have to have someone who is going to be a benevolent dictator of sorts, who's a visionary that has an idea and has the sort of the latitude to be that benevolent dictator and make change happen. And that sort of leadership, unfortunately, just doesn't exist in most academic programs because we, again, have sort of been built on this kind of consensus model where everybody's kind of got to be happy and agree. And that just never happens. So basically you sit around, you talk about change, you have these strategic planning meetings, and then you sort of go back and you do the exact same thing you've always been doing. So that's a bit cynical. That's why we have sort of taken the route of doing sort of startup programs, building them from scratch, where we can have some level of influence over the design and the model.
So you're saying that finding a program that has the freedom of creativity is really the optimal setting or solution for change and growth.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, you've got to have a program director, leadership within that program where there's a culture for doing something different. And you do see this in a number of schools that are starting to, for example, maybe take a 3-year program and make it a 2.5-year program, or programs that are starting to incorporate some elements of online and distance education into the model to give students a bit more flexibility. So these models of innovation are happening within PT education in established programs. They're just happening at extremely kinds of low and slow kinds of rates. And even in the best program, even in the best case scenario, to shift a curriculum that's currently in place, it's going to take you 3 to 4 years to ever see those changes through, right? Because you've always got existing students in the pipeline. So it's like steering the Titanic when you're trying to change curriculum in an existing program.
Dr. Childs, where do you see the future of DPT education going?
Well, I mean, we certainly don't have a crystal ball, but we are putting our stake in the ground that PT school is going to go to something that looks more akin to a 2 to perhaps 2.5-year model. So we're going to see a decrease in the length. We simply don't think that the 3-year DPT with increases in tuition like we're seeing is a sustainable model, that at some point in the not too distant future, we're going to see the applicant pool tipping and really shifting towards other health professions. I mean, why not be a physician assistant, a nurse practitioner? There's a lot of other health professions where you can pay lower educational costs and make more income. The logic of becoming a therapist is starting to become, well, illogical. And so we think it's going to be shorter. And then we also think that there's going to be more and more elements of online presence in programs. We think the days of the brick and mortar schools, they'll still be there. They're not going away anytime soon. But we think that the sort of the modern student, if you will, wants a bit more flexibility. Faculty want more flexibility. There's no real reason why faculty have to live necessarily in the local area of the campus. Frankly, given the technology that's available, students don't necessarily have to live in the local area if the curriculum is designed in a way that facilitates that. So we think we'll see shorter programs, and elements of blended learning coming into those programs will be the future.
So, John, I know there's been a lot of talk among many people in the PT profession regarding residency, some people thinking either being mandatory, some not. What are your overall thoughts about residency, and specifically thoughts on mandatory residency?
Well, it's a great question. Obviously, on the EIM side, we're huge fans of residency. I tell people all the time, I'm embarrassed and not proud of the fact that we're the largest residency provider in the country by a factor of probably 20. And we don't wear that as a badge of honor, that we have that level of scale relative to other programs. We think that it's sort of a black eye. And what I mean by that is we don't have enough capacity of residency providers at this stage to meet the demand. And right now, frankly, the demand for residency, is probably represents maybe at most 10% of those graduating. And yet we can only satisfy maybe 3 to 5% of that demand at best. So by and large, fewer than, call it 5% of graduating therapists go on to residency following graduation. Now, and on the EIM side, I counsel a lot of students to not go into residency when they graduate because they can't afford it. And that's where we think the advantage of the 2-year DPT comes into play, because you shave a year of tuition off, you go into residency, and even if you're making a residency stipend as opposed to a full up comp during residency, you're still making money versus paying tuition. So the net sort of cost over that same period of time, it's a tremendous value because you can get both your DPT and residency. So we don't think residency, well, first of all, let me say this. We certainly I'd love to be alive when the day happens that residency becomes mandatory or so common that it's like in medicine where you really don't see physicians getting employed unless they've completed residency, right? Residency in medicine is not mandatory. It's just that the market won't hire you unless you have done a residency. We'd love to see that same phenomenon happen in PT, but we don't think that's possible until there are more residency opportunities and we see tuition come down in a way that gives therapists sort of the cap space to reasonably complete a residency program. If that can happen in our lifetime, and one day I can sit in my rocking chair and look out and see 90+% of therapists going on to residency training, I'll have lived a pretty good life.
So I know too, for myself personally, I've been kind of struggling with that decision too, whether the residency or no residency. So if someone's not going for residency and they're looking more for a mentor, can you kind of just briefly go into about mentorship and how people can still get that growth, not necessarily even to the point where they don't necessarily even need the residency program, or if it's not necessarily the financially best option?
Yeah, you bet. And again, as I mentioned before, I personally counsel a lot of students. Our admissions folks counsel students not to go into residency. And that may surprise folks because obviously we're in the residency business. But when we have these students who call us and they've got 160,000 or in some cases north of 200,000 when you include undergraduate, and they're really motivated, they want to go into residency and they're going to make, call it 40,000 a year in residency, all the bells and whistles go off and we're like, look, there are other options besides residency. You can go through certification programs, for example. We certainly have those, which we think of as residency light, where you can get the same access to the didactic curriculum, but your mentorship is going to be more, I don't want to say haphazard. It's just not going to be as structured as it is in a residency. So those are really good options. Finding a mentor, I tell people this all the time. It's not as hard as it sounds. You just need to get connected with an employer that really values and invests in their therapist learning. So you want to find out from your employer what sort of resources do they invest in their therapists' continuing education, for example. And, the kinds of therapists, at least in our clinics, we want to employ. We want to employ those, what we think are the top third of therapists. They may want to do residency, but for sure, they're really interested in lifelong learning, regardless of whether they want to do residency. And then we'll invest a significant set of resources into their development over the first 3 to 5 years of their career. So it's really about finding an employer that will sort of stand behind their, everybody says they're interested in quality care, clinical excellence. It's one thing to say it. It's another thing to invest heavily in your therapist's sort of clinical pathway, especially early in your career.
If you could change one aspect of education, what aspect would that be and why?
I think in the DPT program, for example, that we're doing at South College, we sort of iterated on what I think of as two major themes. One was the link, and then one was the model, brick and mortar to more blended. If there's only one of those two, if you tied my hand behind my back, and you can only do one, I would say give me the length and we'll do it in a brick and mortar model. And the reason is because it's really the length that frees up what I call the cap space. And that what I mean by that is the difference between what therapists are paying in a 3-year model versus what they're paying in a 2-year model. And it's not just the difference in tuition. The actual larger difference is the opportunity cost of that 3rd year. In that 3rd year, students in other programs, right, are paying tuition. I'm now graduated in a 2-year program. I have my DPT. I may be going into residency. I may not be. Let's take the example of the student that's not going into residency. So in a 2-year model, maybe they've got a net tuition of, let's make it expensive. Let's call it $100,000 even. So still a pretty premium tuition, but you're not paying tuition in the 3rd year. I go into the employment market. I'm making, call it the average. Let's just be conservative. Let's say I'm making $60,000 a year. My net cost now for PT school is about $40,000 if you compare it to any other student going to a 3-year program. Well, that's as reasonable as any public institution anywhere in the country. And that is an ROI that you can make, that makes sense. So really the length is to me the key point to iterate around and innovate around, because that then frees up that therapist to get into the employment market, perhaps go to residency. And even if they go to residency, it's still a tremendous value relative to a 3-year DPT.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all of, all this amazing content and this just wonderful insight that's really, truly been eye-opening for myself, not really going into the education system too much. Dr. Childs, where can people find you online and on social media?
Yeah, so we're all over on the EIM side, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We're at EIM Team is our EIM handle. That's at EIM Team. I'm pretty active on social media. My handle in most places is at Childs JD. So my last name, J as in John, D as in David. And you can get in touch with me there. My email, John, JOHN at EIMPT.com. Always happy to stay connected with folks. And certainly, folks who've got opinions about the future of education, we love to listen to critics. So if you have a disparate opinion, we're wide open to hearing that and receiving that. We get better by really listening to those who may have different points of view. So we enjoy the healthy debate as well. Thanks for having me.
The pleasure was all ours. And thank you again for coming on the show, Dr. Childs. To our listeners who want to learn more about us, we are online through Facebook at the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. We are also available on Twitter at HET Podcast. And you can also follow us on our website at healthcareeducationtransformationpodcast.com. And on our next episode, we will have Todd Davenport discussing what makes a great educator. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you in class next week.